In 1969, Nixon vowed to end the Vietnam War, but was Vietnamization a genuine strategy or merely a way to escape before everything fell apart? This is the overlooked narrative of America's plan for withdrawing and how it left a nation in peril. By late 1968, America's role in Southeast Asia was at a critical juncture. The Communist forces had suffered significant defeats on the battlefield during the Tet Offensive earlier that year, yet they had achieved a profound psychological victory. Even with U.S. troop numbers at their peak and talk of a light at the end of the tunnel, the scale and intensity of the Communist assaults were shocking, leading to louder demands for withdrawal from Vietnam. A visibly shaken Lyndon Johnson declared he would not seek re-election. Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon faced off for the soon-to-be-opened Oval Office. Nixon made the Vietnam War a central issue in his campaign, pledging new leadership that will end the war and win the peace in the Pacific. He asserted, "Our goal should be to help the South Vietnamese fight their own war, not to fight it for them. If they don't take on the bulk of their own defense, they cannot be saved." Despite later denials, these statements gave many voters the impression that Nixon had a secret plan to bring the war to an end, likely contributing to his electoral success in November. On January 20th, 1969, Richard Milhous Nixon was inaugurated as the 37th President of the United States. Once in office, Nixon encountered the same Vietnam challenges that beset Lyndon Johnson. The escalation and increased troop commitment had been ineffective, with the Tet Offensive highlighting that reality. The stalemate was intolerable not just for those demanding a U.S. withdrawal, but also for a growing number of Americans who had previously supported the war but could no longer accept a prolonged commitment to what seemed like an unwinnable conflict. The only solution was to exit Vietnam, but the dilemma was crafting an exit strategy that would allow the United States to pull out without leaving South Vietnam to the Communists. On his first day in office, Nixon quickly set out to find a way forward, issuing National Security Study Memorandum 1, titled Situation in Vietnam. This was sent to key members of his new administration, asking them to respond to 29 major questions and 50 additional queries across 6 main areas: negotiations, the enemy situation, the status of South Vietnam's armed forces, the pacification effort, the political landscape in South Vietnam, and American goals. The memorandum reached several key players, including the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. According to Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor at the time, this memorandum aimed to sharpen any disagreements so that we could pinpoint the controversial questions and the different points of view. Nixon was particularly concerned about the stability of the Thieu government and whether the South Vietnamese could sustain their fight following any U.S. withdrawal. If he was looking for diverse opinions on the war, he certainly found them in the varied responses to what became known as the 29 questions. Kissinger and his team compiled the replies into a 44-page report, which showed that most respondents believed the Republic of Vietnam could not, in the near future, fend off both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. Similarly, many agreed that the government of Vietnam likely wouldn't withstand serious political challenges from the National Liberation Front, and that, despite suffering losses during the Tet Offensive, the enemy still remained an effective force that could be reinforced from North Vietnam. However, while there was consensus on these issues, opinions diverged regarding the progress made thus far and the long-term outlook for Southeast Asia. 2 contrasting perspectives emerged, with the more hopeful camp, represented by the MAP-V response and echoed by Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker in Saigon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Admiral John S. McCain, Jr. The commander of U.S. Pacific Forces believed that the North Vietnamese had agreed to peace talks in Paris due to their military weakness, pointing out that real gains in pacification were made and the tides are favorable. While the MAP-CV highlighted ongoing improvements in the modernization of the ARVN, it cautioned that South Vietnam was not yet ready to defend itself against a joint assault. It stated, "The RVNF simply are not capable of achieving the self-sufficiency and overwhelming superiority needed to counter both the Viet Cong insurgency and the North Vietnamese Army's main offensives. In light of this, General Creighton W. Abrams, Jr., the MAF-V commander, emphasized that any plan for American troop withdrawal must coincide with a North Vietnamese withdrawal from South Vietnam. In stark contrast, the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, and civilian officials within the Defense Department expressed a more pessimistic outlook, criticizing Saigon's military strength and the progress made by the U.S. The Defense Department even claimed that the South Vietnamese would struggle to contain the Viet Cong, much less a unified enemy threat, without ongoing and robust American support. They agreed that the reported pacification gains were inflated and fragile, and argued that the Communists were not negotiating from a position of weakness on the battlefield. They went to Paris for political and strategic reasons, to reduce costs and pursue their objectives through negotiations, rather than due to impending defeat. This led to two conflicting views regarding the future of South Vietnam and its military capabilities. What was meant to clarify the Vietnam situation and help create a viable strategy ended up complicating matters for the new president. Henry Kissinger noted, the responses made clear that there was no consensus on the facts, let alone on policy. Consequently, Nixon faced a significant dilemma. He had vowed to end the war and bring the troops home, but as Kissinger later noted in his memoirs, it wasn't simply a matter of walking away from a commitment that spanned two administrations, involved 5 allied nations, and resulted in 31,000 casualties. The new president needed to craft an exit strategy to withdraw the United States from Vietnam without just walking away. While ensuring the survival of South Vietnam was still a goal, the primary focus had shifted to getting the U.S. out of Vietnam. Nixon and his advisors began to explore how the U.S. could disengage from the conflict while giving the South Vietnamese at least a fighting chance after American forces departed. They recognized the challenges ahead and even acknowledged the possibility that it might be impossible in the long term. Despite the risks involved in trying to bolster the South Vietnamese military, the president and his key advisors, particularly Defense Secretary Melvin Laird and Secretary of State William Rogers, agreed this was the only viable path forward for the United States to exit Vietnam. Nixon instructed American representatives to take a strong stance, pushing President Thieu and the South Vietnamese leadership to take on more responsibility for the war. It was understood, though never explicitly stated, that an increased combat commitment by the South Vietnamese forces would be a precursor to the withdrawal of American troops, which had by then reached 543,000. To better understand the situation in Southeast Asia, Nixon directed Laird to visit South Vietnam for a first-hand evaluation. On March 5, 1969, Laird, joined by General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, arrived in Saigon. They were briefed by senior military officers who assured them that significant progress was being made in strengthening the South Vietnamese forces. Laird instructed General Abrams to accelerate these efforts so that the bulk of the conflict could be handed over to the Saigon forces as soon as possible. Abrams reiterated his concern that the South Vietnamese were not ready to face the enemy alone. Nonetheless, Laird, citing political pressures back home, directed Abrams to enhance the South Vietnamese forces and transition control of the war to them before the new administration's time ran out. Historian Louis Sorley emphasizes that this was not an entirely new task for Abrams. He had been involved in this mission since serving as Westmoreland's deputy in Saigon. Yet, the sense of urgency was unprecedented. Despite Abrams' caution, Laird returned to Washington firm in his belief that the South Vietnamese could ultimately take over the war, allowing for a full U.S. withdrawal. Having spent 17 years as a Republican congressman, Laird was eager to bring the war to an end, understanding that the grace period typically granted to a new president by the public, the media, and Congress after an election would soon fade. Anti-war sentiment was swelling on Capitol Hill, and Laird realized that Nixon would bear the brunt of it if he failed to act swiftly. Additionally, Laird believed that a prolonged conflict in Vietnam could undermine American strength and credibility globally, particularly in regions far more critical to U.S. security than Southeast Asia. He argued that extending the war would lead to such turmoil and contention that it would severely hinder Nixon's chances for an honorable resolution. As Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Jerry Friedheim noted, Laird was more interested in ending the war in Vietnam rather than winning it. He advised Nixon that the president needed to hand over the entire conflict to the South Vietnamese in order to pull U.S. forces out and appease both the rising anti-war movement and the growing number of Americans who simply wanted the war to end. Laird proposed a strategy aimed at bolstering the South Vietnamese military so they could manage the ongoing insurgency and contend with a lingering North Vietnamese presence. He argued that the significant U.S. footprint in the country hampered the South Vietnamese from taking initiative and moving forward with the war effort. Laird conveyed to Nixon that the focus of senior American commanders in Vietnam seemed more geared toward combat operations rather than empowering the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. He urged for a shift in strategy, suggesting that the senior U.S. military leaders should concentrate on preparing the South Vietnamese to operate independently. To this end, he recommended withdrawing between 50,000 and 70,000 American troops in 1969. During a National Security Council meeting on March 28th, the president and his advisors considered Laird's suggestions. Among those present was General Andrew Goodpaster, who was then General Abrams' deputy in Saigon. He informed the president that the South Vietnamese forces had made significant progress and that Massey V was nearing the point of de-Americanizing the war. However, Henry Kissinger noted that Laird took issue with Goodpaster's terminology and suggested using the term Vietnamization to focus on the key issues. Very soon, this term was embraced as part of Nixon's strategy to transfer the war effort to the South Vietnamese. Laird later explained the goal of this new program before the House Armed Services Committee as the effective assumption by the RVNAF of a larger share of combat operations from American forces, so that U.S. forces can be in fact withdrawn in substantial numbers. Such statements were clearly aimed at gaining support for the new policy from Congress and the American public. Alexander M. Haig, who was with Nixon's national security staff at the time, later called Laird's initiative a stroke of public relations genius, but he pointed out it was a program designed to placate American critics of the war, not an effective defense policy for South Vietnam. Nonetheless, Laird, as per Henry Kissinger, firmly believed in the success of Vietnamization, and it became his main focus. Nixon was swiftly persuaded by Laird's arguments, later noting, "It was on the basis of Laird's enthusiastic advocacy that we undertook the policy of Vietnamization." It may not have taken much for the president to back this approach. Haig claims Nixon had started discussing troop withdrawals shortly after taking office, and Laird's Vietnamization plan provided the justification he needed. It allowed the president to begin phasing down combat operations involving U.S. troops with the ultimate aim of complete withdrawal. However, Nixon understood that American forces couldn't be removed too hastily. While conditions were improving in South Vietnam, significant fighting still persisted. Time was required to strengthen the RVNAF enough to sustain the war independently. Thus, American forces had to continue their combat operations to provide the necessary time to bolster the South Vietnamese forces. In early April 1969, Nixon laid out a new direction for the Vietnam War in National Security Study Memorandum 36. This memorandum called for the creation of a detailed timetable for transferring the responsibility of the war from American to South Vietnamese forces, considering all forms of U.S. military, paramilitary, and civilian involvement, including combat units, advisors, and equipment. The goal was to gradually shift the fighting effort to South Vietnamese troops. Nixon's plan rested on several key assumptions. First, it was believed that if progress in the Paris peace talks stalled, any U.S. withdrawal would be unilateral, without parallel reductions from the North Vietnamese army. This marked a major shift, as it meant the South Vietnamese would have to face both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. Second, the withdrawal of U.S. troops would occur on a trial basis, allowing General Abrams to assess the impact of each phase before proceeding with further troop reductions. Third, it was assumed that South Vietnamese forces would eagerly take on greater military responsibilities. Based on these assumptions, the U.S. troop presence in South Vietnam was intended to shrink to a point where only a small advisory team remained. Despite various government assessments indicating that the South Vietnamese forces would struggle against a united Viet Cong North Vietnamese threat, the Nixon administration implemented a plan to prepare them for this challenge and instructed American leadership in Saigon to prepare for a complete handover of the war efforts. All that remained was to make the strategy public. On June 8, 1969, President Nixon met with South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu in Midway and officially announced the new U.S. policy of Vietnamization. He outlined a steady enhancement of South Vietnamese military capabilities, coupled with increased pressure on the enemy, while American troops would gradually be withdrawn. Nixon stressed that the ultimate aim was to empower the South Vietnamese armed forces and support the Thieu government, enabling them to stand independently against the communists. Before concluding, Nixon stated that he was withdrawing 25,000 troops and that he would continue to pull out more at regular intervals thereafter. He indicated that this withdrawal of U.S. forces depended on three key factors: the progress in training and equipping the South Vietnamese forces, advancements in the Paris negotiations, and the level of enemy activity. Behind closed doors, President Thieu was not happy with Nixon's announcement. Nixon mentioned that Thieu, fully aware of what the final outcome of U.S. withdrawals meant, was deeply troubled. However, Nixon later claimed that he privately assured him, Thieu, through Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, that our support for him was unwavering. Thieu and many of his generals were also frustrated with another element of Vietnamization, the very term itself. The South Vietnamese leaders objected to the entire concept, believing it implied that the ARVN was finally taking on responsibility for the war. For those South Vietnamese who had been battling the communists since the 1950s, the notion that the war was now being Vietnamized felt like an insult. A former ARVN general expressed after the war, "It was, after all, our own war, and we were determined to fight it with or without American troops." In my view, Vietnamization was not a fitting term to use in Vietnam, particularly when propaganda was a significant enemy weapon. Despite these concerns, Henry Kissinger noted that Nixon was overjoyed. He viewed the announcement as a political success and believed it would give him the time needed to develop our strategy. A subsequent memorandum revealed that Nixon hoped his new approach to Vietnamizing the war would show the American public that he had ruled out a purely U.S. solution to the problem in South Vietnam, and indeed had a plan to bring the war to a close. To reinforce this new strategy, Nixon met with Laird and General Wheeler upon his return from Midway. Their discussion focused on changing the mission for General Abrams, as the existing mission statement from President Johnson tasked Matt V with defeating the enemy and forcing his withdrawal to North Vietnam. Following the discussions that came after the Midway announcement, a new directive was issued to Abrams, effective 15th of August. This order instructed him to provide maximum assistance to bolster the armed forces of South Vietnam, enhance the support for pacification efforts, and diminish the supply flow to the enemy along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. With this directive, the initiatives that General Abrams had started upon taking command of Matt V became an official policy of the White House. Nixon's new strategy focused on shifting the burden of combat to the South Vietnamese, while Henry Kissinger worked discreetly in Paris to negotiate a ceasefire and a subsequent peace agreement. In this way, Nixon aimed to withdraw the United States from Southeast Asia while achieving peace with honor. The Vietnamization effort unfolded in three phases. In the first phase, the responsibility for the majority of ground combat against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese would gradually shift to the RVNF. During this time, the United States would still offer air, naval, and logistical support. The second phase involved building the RVNF's capabilities to enable self-reliance, which included increasing artillery, air, naval resources, and other support activities. This second phase ran parallel to the first, but would take more time to realize. Even after most U.S. combat forces were withdrawn, American troops would still provide support, security, and training. The third phase entailed reducing the American presence to just an advisory role, with a small security contingent left behind for protection. It was expected that the advisory presence would diminish as South Vietnam grew stronger, but initially the strategy included maintaining a small residual force in South Vietnam for some time to come. As Laird explained to a House subcommittee in February 1970, statements like this reassured the South Vietnamese that the United States would not abandon them. However, as calls for complete U.S. withdrawal grew louder, the notion of a residual U.S. force in Vietnam would eventually be discarded, leading to dire consequences for South Vietnam's future. While the United States continued its combat operations with American troops, the newly introduced Vietnamization policy initially aimed at modernizing and strengthening the South Vietnamese armed forces. This was not a brand new initiative. Earlier in the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, particularly during the American buildup from 1965 to 1967, it had taken a back seat as military leaders concentrated on operations led by American units. With Richard Nixon's election and his focus on Vietnamization, the goal of enhancing South Vietnamese forces surged to the forefront for Massey V. When Nixon met President Thieu at Midway in June 1969 to announce the Vietnamization policy, Thieu expressed serious concerns about the capabilities of his forces amid the inevitable withdrawal of U.S. troops. Abrams was tasked with collaborating with the South Vietnamese to create a plan aimed at further enhancing the structure and combat effectiveness of the RVNAF. This resulting improvement program, dubbed the Midway Increase, received Laird's approval on August 18, 1969. Simultaneously, Laird instructed Matt V and the Joint Staff to evaluate all current and planned initiatives for enhancing the RVNAF, emphasizing the need to consider not only structural and equipment upgrades, but also fresh approaches to improving leadership, training, and developing strategies and tactics that suited South Vietnamese capabilities. On September 2nd, Abrams replied to Laird's instructions, clearly stating that even with the Midway Increase, the proposed modernization efforts would not enable the South Vietnamese to manage the existing combined threat. He pointed out issues such as poor leadership, high desertion rates, and corruption within the upper ranks of the RVNF, declaring that he believed the forces could not be enhanced adequately in either quantity or quality to meet the challenges ahead. Furthermore, he firmly indicated that he thought the expectations set by the Secretary of Defense were unrealistic within the given time frame and available resources. Laird struggled to accept Abrams's evaluation, because doing so would require him to acknowledge that the United States could never exit South Vietnam smoothly. This was especially true considering the clear reality that North Vietnam was unlikely to agree to a joint withdrawal of U.S. and PAVN troops. On November 10th, he instructed the Joint Chiefs of Staff to devise a new plan that would, in one way or another, establish a South Vietnamese military capable of maintaining at least current levels of security. He asked the military planners to prepare for unilateral troop withdrawals that would initially reduce American forces to a support force of between 190,000 and 260,000 by July 1971, followed by a much smaller advisory force by July 1973. In essence, he was reiterating his request for a workable Vietnamization strategy, but emphasizing that they should not count on a significant American support presence remaining. It seemed that Abrams and his team, despite their deep concerns, recognized that the decision for U.S. withdrawal was already made and tried to create the best possible plan given Laird's firm instructions. To adhere to the Secretary's directives, military planners assumed a diminished Viet Cong threat and a reduction in PAVN presence in South Vietnam, while largely overlooking the North Vietnamese troops stationed just outside South Vietnam's borders. Based on these questionable assumptions, MACV presented its new recommendations by the end of December. In January 1970, the Joint Chiefs incorporated these assumptions into the Phase 3 RVNAF Improvement and Modernization Plan, which aimed to increase RVNAF personnel to over 1,061,505 within a 3-year time frame and activate and equip 10 new artillery battalions, 24 truck companies, and 6 additional helicopter squadrons. Laird viewed this plan as a positive move, but worried that Massey V planners still hadn't grasped that a significant residual American support force wouldn't exist, suspecting they might be stalling the withdrawal. Therefore, in mid-February 1970, Laird traveled to Saigon for a meeting with Abrams and Tew to stress the urgency of the matter. He expressed disappointment over what he saw as a lack of new strategies from MACV in executing the Vietnamization program. During his time in Saigon, he held separate meetings with high-ranking South Vietnamese generals who voiced their concerns regarding the Phase 3 plan. They repeated previous requests for additional artillery, including long-range 175mm pieces and air defense systems, while also seeking financial support to enhance the conditions of their soldiers. Upon returning to Washington, Laird instructed the Joint Chiefs of Staff to reassess the Phase 3 plan, taking into account the requests from South Vietnam, and to generate a more comprehensive strategy. 2 months later, the Joint Chiefs presented the updated plan, which would be known as the Consolidated RVNF Improvement and Modernization Plan, or CRIMP. This plan, applied to the fiscal years of 1970 to 1972, increased the total supported South Vietnamese military force to an even 1.1 million. CRIMP significantly influenced the entire RVNAF. As before, the ARVN received the bulk of the enhancements, ultimately acquiring 155mm and 175mm long-range artillery, M42 and M55 anti-aircraft systems, M48 tanks, along with a range of other advanced weaponry and equipment. By the end of 1969, the U.S. had delivered 1,200 tanks and armored vehicles, 30,000 machine guns, 4,000 mortars, 20,000 radios, and 25,000 jeeps and trucks. The new armaments and gear received in the 2 years after CRIMP's approval enabled the ARVN to activate an additional division, the 3rd Infantry Division, along with various smaller units, including 25 Border Ranger battalions, many artillery battalions, 4 armored cavalry squadrons, 3 tank battalions, 2 armored brigade headquarters, and 3 anti-aircraft battalions. By early 1972, the South Vietnamese Army's strength had risen to 450,000, comprising 171 infantry battalions, 22 armored cavalry and tank squadrons, and 64 artillery battalions. The territorial, regional, and popular forces also saw considerable benefits from CRIMP. As the Vietnamization process progressed, MATV and Washington aimed to compensate for the voids left by withdrawing U.S. divisions by expanding the RF and PF, with the hope that they could assume the primary responsibility for territorial security and assist in the pacification efforts. This expansion initiative entailed a substantial increase in personnel and upgraded equipment. Under CRIMP, the regional forces and popular forces received modern weapons like M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, and M79 grenade launchers, all significant upgrades from the collection of outdated weapons they had been using. The arrival of new 105mm howitzers allowed the Joint General Staff to eventually establish 174 territorial artillery sections to support the RF, PF, and Border Ranger forces, greatly enhancing the firepower available to these units, while lessening the load on regular artillery, who could then concentrate on aiding regular maneuver battalions in combat. Additionally, the personnel strength of the regional and popular forces was boosted to increase the number of government troops in the countryside for the pacification efforts. The command structure of the regional forces was enhanced, and several RF group commands were created. It wasn't just the ground forces that benefited from CRIMP. The Vietnamese Air Force also experienced significant growth, increasing from 17,000 personnel in late 1968 to 37,000 by the close of 1969, and reaching 64,000 by 1973. Along with this personnel boost, there were substantial upgrades to aircraft and command and control capabilities. Older propeller-driven aircraft in the VNF were replaced with A-37 and F-5A jet fighter bombers, significantly improving ground support capabilities. The VNF's cargo capacity also received upgrades, transitioning from C-47 aircraft to C-119s initially, and later to C-123 and C-7 models. The helicopter fleet, controlled entirely by the VNF, grew considerably as U.S. Army aviation units redeployed, passing their aircraft and equipment to newly formed Vietnamese helicopter squadrons. By late 1972, as the United States geared up for a complete withdrawal, the VNAF, as part of a special initiative known as Enhance Plus, acquired 32 C-130A cargo planes, along with more C-7 planes, F-5A fighter bombers, and helicopters. During this period, the Vietnamese Air Force expanded to 6 times its size from 1964, and by 1973, operated 1,700 aircraft, including over 500 helicopters. By that time, the Air Force had expanded to 6 divisions, featuring a total of 10 A-37 fighter bomber squadrons, 3 A-1H attack helicopter squadrons, 3 F-5E fighter bomber squadrons, 17 UH-1 helicopter squadrons, 4 CH-47 helicopter squadrons, 10 liaison and observation squadrons, 3 C-7 squadrons, and several AC-47, AC-119, and EC-47 squadrons, along with additional training units. When the U.S. withdrew in 1973, the Vietnamese Air Force had become one of the most formidable air forces in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese Navy also experienced considerable growth during the Vietnamization phase. Starting with only 17,000 personnel in 1968, the Navy expanded to 40,000 by 1972. To bolster the VNN's capabilities and fulfill the Vietnamization objectives, MACV initiated 2 new programs in 1969. The first was the Accelerated Turnover of Assets, or ATOV, aimed at quickly enhancing naval strength and training while facilitating the transfer of ships and combat responsibilities from the U.S. Navy to the South Vietnamese Navy. The second program, known as the Accelerated Turnover of Logistics, focused on improving naval logistical support. In May 1969, the VNN received 2 small cruisers. Soon after, the U.S. Navy Riverine Force began transferring its vessels and river patrol duties to the VNN. By mid-1970, over 500 U.S. brownwater Navy boats had been handed over to South Vietnam. In September of that year, the VNN took over the ships and operations of the Market Time Coastal Interdiction Program. By 1972, the Vietnamese Navy operated a fleet exceeding 1,700 vessels, encompassing sea patrol craft, large cargo ships, coastal and river patrol crafts, and amphibious ships. In terms of the quantity of equipment and modern resources, Vietnamization achieved significant success. By 1970, South Vietnam had made remarkable strides in modernization, positioning itself as one of the largest and best-equipped military forces in the world. However, equipment and numbers alone were not sufficient to address the challenges that South Vietnam faced as it prepared to take full responsibility for the war. Improving the combat capabilities of the South Vietnamese armed forces was essential. To accomplish this, MACV increasingly prioritized training and advisory efforts, which had been in place since the earliest days of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. U.S. advisors operated mainly in 3 key areas. They supported South Vietnamese combat units, participated in training programs, and engaged in provincial pacification efforts. The MACV headquarters played a vital role in advising the Joint General Staff, which was the top command of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces. However, only a portion of the MACV headquarters staff actually functioned as true advisors. In 1970, out of 1,668 authorized positions across MACV's 15 staff agencies, only 397 were officially designated as advisors to the government of Vietnam and the JGS. As the conflict dragged on and more U.S. troops pulled out, the MAPV staff became increasingly focused on advisory roles. Beneath the JGS were 4 South Vietnamese Corps commanders, each overseeing a Corps tactical zone, which would later be referred to as military regions. Initially, the senior U.S. Field Force commanders were assigned to these zones. These senior commanders had 2 deputies who worked closely with the South Vietnamese forces. One deputy focused on civil operations and revolutionary development support, serving as the main advisor to the ARVN Corps commander in pacification and development efforts. The other deputy was the senior advisor to the Corps commander and the chief of the U.S. Army Advisory Group at the ARVN Corps' headquarters. This team provided crucial support and guidance in areas like command, administration, training, combat operations, intelligence, logistics, political warfare, and civil affairs. As more U.S. units and senior field force leadership were withdrawn, the advisory program evolved. Between 1971 and 1972, 4 regional assistance commands were formed, with the regional assistance commander, usually a U.S. Army Major General, taking the place of the departing Field Force commander as the primary advisor to the South Vietnamese Corps commander in each military region. The role of the regional assistance commander was to support the ARVN Corps commander in building and maintaining a strong military capability. This was achieved by advising and assisting RVNAF military and paramilitary leaders at every level on military operations, training, intelligence, personnel management, and combat support activities. To facilitate this, the Regional Assistance Commander had a team that worked closely with the ARVN Corps staff. He also managed the subordinate U.S. Army advisory groups and pacification advisory organizations within the military region. His team provided guidance, support, and assistance across all levels of South Vietnamese command for both combat operations and pacification efforts. Beneath the senior U.S. advisor in each military region were 2 main types of advisory teams: province advisory teams and division advisory teams. Each of South Vietnam's 44 provinces was led by a province chief, often a colonel from the South Vietnamese Army or Marines, who oversaw the provincial government and commanded the local, regional, and popular forces. Under the CORDS program, launched in 1967, an advisory system was set up to help these province chiefs manage the pacification program. The American counterpart to the province chief was the province senior advisor, who could be either military or civilian, depending on the security conditions of the province. This advisor and their team were charged with guiding the province chief in both civil and military aspects of the pacification and development programs. The staff of the province senior advisor, made up of U.S. military and civilian members, was split into 2 sections. One focused on area and community development, covering public health, civil affairs, education, agriculture, psychological operations, and logistics. The other section concentrated on plans and operations, concentrating on developing plans and assisting in the management of military operations by the territorial forces in the province. The province chief exercised his authority through district chiefs. To offer guidance and support to the district chiefs, the province senior advisor oversaw the district senior advisors, each backed by a team of about 8 members, although the actual size could vary based on the specific needs of that district. These district advisory teams aided the district chief in both military and civil aspects of the pacification and development program. Additionally, the district team and, if needed, mobile assistance training teams provided advice and training to the RFPFs within the district. By the end of 1967, around 4,000 U.S. military and civilian personnel were engaged in the CORDS advisory effort. When Vietnamization was officially announced in 1969, the total U.S. Army advisory strength reached approximately 13,500, with half assigned to CORDS organizations. This increase stemmed from the expansion of the pacification program that followed the 1968 Tet Offensive. In addition to the CORDS teams, there were also advisory teams supporting the RVNF regular forces. In January 1969, MACV launched the Combat Assistance Team, or CAT, initiative to enhance the capabilities of regular ARVN divisions. This plan focused on decreasing the number of tactical advisors in the field, while shifting their role from advising to coordinating combat support at the ARVN division level. The Division Combat Assistance Team aimed to advise and assist the ARVN division commander and his staff in managing command and control, administration, training, tactical operations, intelligence, security, logistics, and certain aspects of political warfare. Typically, the division's senior advisor was a U.S. Army colonel who oversaw the regimental and battalion advisory teams. Each ARVN division typically consisted of 3 infantry regiments, 1 artillery regiment, and various separate battalions like a cavalry squadron and an engineer battalion. Regimental advisory teams generally comprised 8 to 12 U.S. Army personnel, eventually reduced in size as U.S. forces were drawn down, and were typically led by a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel incorporating a mix of officers and non-commissioned officers. Separate battalion advisory teams usually included 1 or 2 specialists who advised the South Vietnamese in specific functional areas, such as cavalry, intelligence, engineering, and logistics. Elite ARVN troops, including airborne and ranger units, were structured similarly to regular ARVN forces, with the regiment being the highest level of command. Each regiment was accompanied by an American advisory team led by a colonel, which was larger than those found with standard ARVN regiments. The advisory framework for the Vietnamese Marine Corps mirrored that of the ARVN, although the advisors were from the U.S. Marine Corps. U.S. advisors did not hold command nor have operational control over any South Vietnamese forces. Their role was to offer professional military guidance and assistance to their Vietnamese counterparts. The goal was for these advisory teams to eventually reduce their presence as the ARVN and VNMC gained more responsibility for planning and executing their missions. Alongside U.S. advisors involved in the Corps' initiative and those with South Vietnamese combat units in the field, a substantial number of advisors were also dedicated to supporting the RVNF training base, aiming to enhance the training of South Vietnamese forces. By the end of 1972, South Vietnam would boast one of the largest and most modern military forces in Southeast Asia. However, even the best equipment was ineffective if the soldiers, sailors, and airmen lacked the skills or motivation to effectively utilize it against the enemy. Training the Vietnamese had been a high priority on paper throughout the war, but in reality, it had not received enough focus before Vietnamization began. Even after this new policy was implemented, enhancing South Vietnamese training remained a challenging task. The ARVN training system was comprised of 56 various training centers, which included 9 national centers, excluding those for airborne and marine divisions that had their own facilities, and 37 provincial centers. This extensive network of educational institutions fell under the RVNF Central Training Command, first established in 1966. The MACV Training Directorate, tasked with fostering a robust military training system for the RVNF, provided U.S. advisors to RVNF schools and training centers. These advisors worked alongside RVNF commandants to develop and implement training programs. On the surface, the RVNF training system in 1968 appeared impressive, but a closer look showed it was ineffective in producing capable leaders and soldiers needed for the war effort. While MACV proposed various improvements to the Vietnamese Joint General Staff and Central Training Command to enhance the personnel capacity and effectiveness of South Vietnamese training facilities, these suggestions were largely ignored by RVNF High Command. The MACV Command Overview noted that progress in 1969 was minimal due to complicated personnel changes, the reluctance of the JGS to prioritize the program, and RVN field commanders' refusal to release experienced officers and non-commissioned officers from their duties. By early 1970, U.S. officials were so concerned that the Army Chief of Staff sent a fact-finding team led by Brig Gen Donnelly Bolton to Vietnam. This team assessed RVNF training facilities and evaluated U.S. training support. They found the combined efforts of South Vietnamese personnel and U.S. advisors to be insufficient. The MACV Training Directorate was operating at only 70% of its assigned strength, and U.S. training advisory units in the field were similarly lacking. Furthermore, the quality of the advisors assigned to RVNF schools was questionable. Those perceived as unfit for more prestigious roles often found themselves in training positions. Caller Stan L. McClellan, a member of the Bolton team, remarked that it was evident that the best professionals were not being assigned to advisory training roles. General Abrams agreed with the findings of the Bolton team and encouraged Bolton to advise the Joint Chiefs of Staff, upon his return to the Pentagon, to send more highly skilled training advisors to Vietnam. He had significant concerns about ensuring that his advisory teams were made up of personnel at their proper ranks, such as lieutenant colonels in designated lieutenant colonel positions. This approach would help decrease the number of lower-ranking advisors who lacked combat experience. Abrams stated, "It's time for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington to acknowledge that the era of U.S. combat involvement in South Vietnam has concluded. Our focus now is solely on preparing South Vietnam to take over the responsibility." While trying to persuade the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the essential nature of the advisory mission in South Vietnam, Abrams also applied pressure on the RVNF High Command to enhance their training system. In a letter to General Cao Van Vien, the chief of the Joint General Staff, he urged senior South Vietnamese commanders to actively support the training initiative. He emphasized that support for CTC activities needs to be broad and accelerated. It's crucial to engage the personal interest and help of commanders at corps, divisional tactical areas, and sectors, each of whom relies on the training system's output and should work to enhance its quality. Thanks to Abrams' urging and the recognition that U.S. forces were indeed withdrawing, the RVNF High Command began prioritizing the improvement of their training system. The fact that the United States invested $28 million to expand and upgrade the South Vietnamese facilities also played a significant role. Eventually, there would be a total of 33 major military and service schools, 13 national and regional training centers, and 14 division training centers. By 1970, South Vietnamese leaders began reallocating experienced officers and non-commissioned officers to the training centers. Although field commanders were hesitant to part with their seasoned small unit leaders, by the end of 1971, almost half of the South Vietnamese training instructors were individuals with combat experience. By this time, the number of U.S. training advisory personnel had grown, and by the close of 1971, over 3,500 U.S. advisors were actively involved in training at most of the training centers and major South Vietnamese Air Force schools. Even as the South Vietnamese began to recognize the need to enhance their training programs, the quality and quantity of U.S. advisors remained a concern. This issue extended beyond those in the training centers to the advisory personnel at all levels, including field units and advisory teams. In December 1969, as the Vietnamization policy gained traction with significant changes in force structure, equipment, and training, Secretary Laird, understanding the importance of the advisory effort in the Vietnamization process, asked the service secretaries to explore ways to improve the overall advisory mission. Prior to this, many in the U.S. Army viewed advisory roles as less appealing compared to field command with U.S. units, leading many officers and non-commissioned officers to shy away from advisory duty. Often, the decision of who would become an advisor depended largely on who was available for overseas duty when slots opened up due to rotations or casualties. For those chosen as advisors, training consisted of a 6-week course at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, followed by 8 weeks of Vietnamese language training at the Defense Language Institute. Consequently, many advisors lacked the necessary experience, training, or desire for the role. Laird aimed to rectify this situation, seeking to assign the best individuals as advisors. Initially, he received little support from the Army. Secretary of the Army Stanley Reser stated he would continue examining the issue, but provided no practical solutions. The Army was grappling with severe personnel challenges, as the demands of the war led to officers and non-commissioned officers returning to Vietnam for multiple tours, often less than a year apart, and the need for advisors only intensified the strain on the personnel system. Despite this, Abrams continued to advocate for a greater emphasis on assigning qualified, combat-experienced officers to advisory positions. He called for leaders who could influence the process of pacification, officers who would empathize with the Vietnamese, recognize their strengths, and grasp their vulnerabilities. He sought advisors who could extract ideas and actions from the Vietnamese, all aimed at two key objectives: pacification and improving the South Vietnamese armed forces. Laird shared Abrams' view on the importance of filling advisory roles and instructed service secretaries to send only the most qualified personnel to these positions. Eventually, the message reached the services, and by the end of 1970, South Vietnam's training advisory effort saw a boost in skilled military professionals. The advisory effort also gained traction from the reduction of U.S. troops. As American units left, the demand for combat roles diminished, allowing many officers originally slated for U.S. units to shift to advisory duties. During 1969, the size of field advisory teams grew from around 7,000 to 11,900, and then to 14,332 by 1970. While Abrams concentrated on enhancing the advisory process, President Nixon and Secretary Laird urged for quicker troop reductions. Nixon had first announced the U.S. troop withdrawal at Midway, but found fresh motivation to accelerate the plan through former Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford. In June 1969, Clifford wrote in Foreign Affairs, advocating for the unilateral withdrawal of 100,000 troops by the year's end and all other personnel by the close of 1970, leaving only logistics and Air Force members behind. Nixon, never one to back down from a challenge, claimed at a press conference that he could surpass Clifford's timeline. This assertion garnered significant media attention and effectively committed the U.S. to a unilateral withdrawal from South Vietnam, removing any leverage for troop reductions in Kissinger's negotiations with the North Vietnamese in Paris. This shift would have profound implications for peace talks and the effectiveness of the eventual ceasefire agreement. The initial redeployment of 25,000 U.S. troops that President Nixon promised took place by August 27, 1969, when the last soldiers from the 1st and 2nd Brigades of the 9th Infantry Division left the Mekong Delta. In the months after the Midway announcement, discussions continued about how many troops the U.S. would pull out and how quickly. Laird proposed several options for 1969, ranging from withdrawing 50,000 troops at the lowest to 100,000 at the highest, with various combinations in between. He warned the president in a memorandum to be cautious about withdrawing too many troops too fast, as it could seriously affect the pacification program. Laird's warning turned out to be timely. On August 6th, as soldiers from the 9th Infantry Division were getting ready to leave South Vietnam, a communist attack hit Cam Ranh Bay. Just 5 days later, the communists struck over 100 cities, towns, and bases across South Vietnam. An official North Vietnamese history later revealed that the Politburo in Hanoi had determined, following the Midway announcement, that the United States had lost its will to fight in Vietnam. This led the communists to believe they could dictate the level and intensity of combat, prompting their new wave of attacks. When Nixon announced the initial troop withdrawal in June, he highlighted that one key factor for any further reductions would be the level of enemy activity. These recent communist assaults clearly contradicted Nixon's conditions, prompting him to delay any decisions on additional troop withdrawals. This caused significant backlash in Congress and the media. On September 12th, the National Security Council convened to address the situation. Kissinger stated that a very natural response from us would have been to stop bringing soldiers home, but by now withdrawal had gained its own momentum. 2 days before the meeting, Kissinger had sent the president a memorandum expressing concerns about the current course in South Vietnam. He cautioned that withdrawals of U.S. troops will become like salted peanuts to the American public. The more U.S. troops come home, the more will be demanded. This could eventually lead to an effective call for unilateral withdrawal. The more troops are pulled out, the more Hanoi will be encouraged. Kissinger's insights would prove accurate, but during the NSC meeting, he stood alone in opposing the decision to proceed with the planned troop reductions. On September 16th, Nixon ordered the redeployment of an additional 35,000 American troops by December. Kissinger noted that the withdrawals became relentless, with the president never allowing the end of one withdrawal period to pass without announcing a new one. By December 15th, Nixon ordered a third deployment of 50,000 troops to leave before April 1970. On April 20th, Nixon revealed that while 110,000 U.S. troops had been set for redeployment in the first 3 increments, the actual number that left Vietnam was 115,000. The next phase of withdrawal, from April 1970 to April 1971, aimed to cut the U.S. presence by another 150,000. By the end of 1970, roughly 344,000 U.S. troops remained in South Vietnam, with the 9th Infantry Division, the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 3rd Marine Division, 2 brigades of the 25th Infantry Division, and the entire 4th Infantry Division already redeployed. As these forces prepared to leave, they halted combat operations, transferring responsibility for their operational areas to the RVNAF. From the first announcement of U.S. troop withdrawals in June 1969 until the end of November 1972, 14 troop increments were brought home, dropping the U.S. strength in Vietnam from a peak of 543,400 to a residual force of 27,000. Once the initial pullout began, the RVNF had to take on greater responsibility for the war, irrespective of the progress in Vietnamization and pacification. This was the challenge faced by General Abrams. Confronted with an ongoing conflict, he had to ramp up efforts to ready the RVNF to cover the void left by the departing U.S. forces. He was essentially racing against the clock. When Abrams took command of MACV in 1968, he recognized the need to bolster the combat capabilities of the South Vietnamese armed forces. Even before President Nixon officially introduced Vietnamization as the new U.S. strategy, General Abrams had already begun implementing measures to enhance the training effectiveness of the RVF. However, historically, this focus had not been the priority of MACV. Abrams inherited the long-standing mission of engaging and defeating the Communists to drive them out of South Vietnam. When Nixon announced the Vietnamization policy, along with the new mission statement, Abrams was instructed to help the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces take on a larger role in combat operations. His focus was on providing maximum support to the South Vietnamese to strengthen their military, aiding the pacification efforts, and cutting off supplies to the enemy. Despite his deep concerns about the rapid withdrawal of U.S. troops, General Abrams recognized the task at hand and intensified efforts to enhance the combat effectiveness of South Vietnamese units. This was a challenge that had been on his mind since he took command. He realized that American and South Vietnamese forces were essentially fighting two separate wars. Abrams aimed to unify their roles and missions under a single combined strategy, thereby eliminating the dual strategies of attrition and pacification. He defined this one-war approach as a strategy aimed at protecting the population so the civil government could assert its authority, rather than simply aiming to destroy enemy forces. This approach was already in effect under Abrams' leadership, but was formalized in the MACV Objectives Plan approved in March 1969. This plan was later jointly adopted by the U.S. and Saigon as the Combined Strategic Objectives Plan, which highlighted that the RVNF needed to be fully engaged in all operations to prepare for the time they'd take full responsibility. Once the new plan was implemented, Abrams worked diligently to ensure MACV forces embraced his one-war approach, putting an end to the divisions that had previously hindered their collective efforts. So when he received the official directive from President Nixon, Abrams was already redirecting MACV's focus. Armed with this new combined strategy and encouraged by his commander-in-chief to Vietnamize the war, Abrams aimed to bring the combat situation under control while progressively shifting the burden of responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese as the American troop withdrawals escalated. One approach he sought was to have the ARVN engage alongside American troops in joint operations. While American and South Vietnamese forces had teamed up before the implementation of the one-war policy, the South Vietnamese typically played a supportive role on the outskirts of main combat activities in earlier missions. Many American commanders hesitated to work with South Vietnamese units, often viewing the ARVN as more of a burden than an asset, believing they were more likely to create challenges than to be beneficial. Although the dynamics shifted somewhat after the 1968 Tet Offensive, Abrams, facing the urgent need to transfer responsibilities to the South Vietnamese, mandated closer collaboration between the two forces. The aim was for American units to act as exemplars for Saigon's soldiers by more seamlessly integrating the operations of the two nations. This method proved successful in South Korea and ultimately enhanced the capabilities of the Republic of Korea's military. Abrams and his advisors clearly hoped that the Korean strategy would also apply to the South Vietnamese. Though the integration of South Vietnamese troops into the primary fighting effort was inconsistent and varied across different regions, several new initiatives were launched following Abrams' guidance. In I-Corps Tactical Zone, Lieutenant Gen. Richard G. Stilwell, the U.S. A 14 Corps commander, collaborated closely with ARVN Commander Ma Gen Ngo Quang Truong, incorporating South Vietnamese units into operational strategies as equal partners. Under this essentially joint command, the South Vietnamese worked closely with U.S. forces including the 3rd Marine Division, the 101st Airborne Division, and the 1st Brigade of the 5th Infantry Division in Quang Tri and Toi Tien provinces. After Stilwell's replacement by M.G. Melvin Zeiss later in 1969, the new commander maintained Stilwell's focus on joint operations, and U.S. forces in I Corps increased their cooperative efforts with the ARVN. Abrams was very satisfied with how well the ARVN forces performed in I Corps. Later, in 1969, he directed the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division to move south, shifted the remaining American combat forces in the area towards security, and eventually sent one of the 2 American Marine divisions back home. In 2 Corps Tactical Zone, U.S. commanders also aimed for joint operations, but they found less success. Lieutenant Gen. William R. Pears, commander of I Field Force, along with Lieutenant Gen. Lu Lan of ARVN 2 Corps, launched the Pair-Off program. This initiative required each ARVN unit to be closely linked with a U.S. counterpart, conducting operations together regardless of the size of the forces involved. Coordination and collaboration extended from the corps level down to battalions and districts. Under this plan, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division and the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade partnered with the ARVN 22nd and 23rd Infantry Divisions. During the time following the Pair-Off program's launch, 3 notable combined operations were carried out in each corps, each achieving a modest degree of success. However, this approach was not as effective as the combined efforts in UNCOR, and several factors contributed to this. First, unlike I Corps, the 2 corps-level headquarters were located separately, making coordination more challenging. Moreover, the ARVN field commanders in 2 Corps were less enthusiastic about collaborating with U.S. forces compared to M.G. Truong and his counterparts in I Corps. As a result, there was a lack of motivation to learn from the Americans, which impacted the coordination and cooperation between the 2 forces. In 3 Corps Tactical Zone, U.S. 2 Field Force Commander Lieutenant Gen. Julian Ewell and Lieutenant Gen. Do Cao Tri of ARVN 3 Corps introduced a program known as Dong Tien, or Progress Together. The program aimed to enhance both the quantity and quality of combined operations, significantly bolster 3 main ARVN missions: pacification support, improving combat effectiveness, and intensifying combat efforts, and greatly improve the efficient use of critical combat resources, particularly Army aviation assets. This initiative emphasized a continuous partnership between ARVN 3 Corps and U.S. 2 Field Force units. As an ARVN battalion reached a commendable level of combat readiness, it was scheduled to transition out of the program and return to independent operations. The Dong Tien initiative positively impacted ARVN units across 3 Corps. The 1st U.S. and 5th ARVN Infantry Divisions collaborated closely, and the repeated joint operations prepared the ARVN Division to take over the American unit's area of operations when it was redeployed in 1970. When the 5th ARVN Division shifted its command center to Bin Long Province and took control of the former Big Red 1 territory, a significant milestone in the Vietnamization process was achieved. While not all of these combined operations were successful, they generally played a crucial role in enhancing the battlefield skills of the RVNF units. This laid the groundwork for South Vietnamese commanders and soldiers to take on new responsibilities as more U.S. forces began to pull out. Unfortunately, these initiatives could not resolve many of the deep-rooted issues that plagued the RVNAF and contributed to the South Vietnamese regime's eventual collapse. The expanding RVNAF grappled with a shortage of technical skills, ineffective staff officers, and a lack of experience in planning and executing large-scale combined arms operations, among other serious challenges. The leadership question, especially at higher levels, was at the heart of all RVNF deficiencies. This concern was significant for General Abrams and his senior commanders as they sought to prepare the South Vietnamese for greater responsibility in the conflict. Programs like Pair-Off and Dong Tien aimed to strengthen RVNF leadership and combat capabilities but fell short of remedying the long-term issues within the South Vietnamese structure. By late 1969, Vietnamization had achieved progress in various areas. The modernization effort succeeded in equipping all ARVN units with contemporary gear. Renewed focus had been placed on the advisory effort, and RVNF's training system was on the rise. The redeployment of U.S. troops compelled the RVNF to take on increased responsibility for the war, with the number of battalion-sized operations conducted by the South Vietnamese nearly doubling from 1968 to 1969. Still, the combat performance of the South Vietnamese remained inconsistent at best. Some units, like the 51st ARVN Infantry Battalion, excelled against their communist foes, while others, such as the 22nd ARVN Infantry Division, struggled significantly in the field. The 22nd had conducted 1,300 ambushes during the summer of 1969, yet only managed to kill 6 enemy soldiers. The MAXEV Office of Information highlighted the growing involvement of RVNAF, stressing that South Vietnamese forces would eventually stand on their own. However, many advisors were concerned that the South Vietnamese remained overly reliant on U.S. support and doubted their ability to continue the fight independently once the United States withdrew. The MAXEV's public statements had a point. It was clear that South Vietnam needed time to develop a strong defense against the North. The pressing question for many was whether there was enough time before all U.S. forces pulled out. Vietnamization faced its first significant test in the spring of 1970, when Nixon ordered an incursion into North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. This operation involved 32,000 American soldiers and 48,000 South Vietnamese troops. The main assault on the Fishhook region was led by the 1st Cavalry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, while South Vietnamese forces targeted the Parrot's Beak region. Both attacks were successful, leading Allied forces to discover and dismantle numerous large communist base camps, seizing a staggering amount of supplies, including over 16 million rounds of various ammunition, 45,000 rockets, 2,900 individual weapons, 2,500 crew-served weapons, 5,500 landmines, 62,000 grenades, 14 million pounds of rice, and 435 vehicles. The South Vietnamese troops, primarily under the command of Lieutenant Do Cao Tri and supported by U.S. artillery and air power, executed their missions effectively. Nixon proclaimed that the South Vietnamese performance in Cambodia was clear evidence of the success of Vietnamization. Yet, the reality was a bit more complicated than Nixon wished to acknowledge, as many of the South Vietnamese forces involved in the incursion were elite units, not representative of the larger contingent of South Vietnamese troops. Additionally, there hadn't been any fierce fighting in the ARVN sector because most communist troops fled when the Allied forces began their invasion. Still, South Vietnamese artillery struggled to support their own forces, leading ARVN commanders to depend heavily on U.S. firepower. Thus, Nixon's portrayal of South Vietnamese capabilities was somewhat misleading. The serious deficiencies within the RVNAF were clearly evident the following year during Operation Lam Son 719, aimed at disrupting the Ho Chi Minh Trail and denying North Vietnamese safe havens. The objective was to target several base areas along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, right next to Military Region 1. Although U.S. air support was involved this time, American ground troops weren't allowed to cross the border, meaning the South Vietnamese forces had to launch the attack alone, without U.S. units or advisors. The assault along Highway 9 into Laos began at 7 a.m. on February 8th and started off fairly well. The South Vietnamese secured their initial goals, but soon got bogged down along the highway. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese reinforcements quickly arrived, sparking a significant battle that lasted a month. While some South Vietnamese soldiers fought bravely, many others either performed poorly or fled in fear. The operation concluded with ARVN units retreating chaotically back across the border. U.S. sources reported South Vietnamese casualties at 3,800 killed, 5,200 wounded, and 775 missing. Nixon attempted to spin the situation positively, but the reality was that the South Vietnamese had not performed well independently. Without U.S. ground support and their advisors, the South Vietnamese struggled against North Vietnamese regulars in open combat. Lam Son 719 revealed that Vietnamization hadn't been the success Nixon claimed, and the improvement of the South Vietnamese forces was still very much a work in progress. Following the setback in Laos, U.S. and South Vietnamese military officials focused on boosting the morale and confidence of the ARVN, intensifying training programs and providing new equipment to replace what was lost during Lam Son. Meanwhile, the withdrawal of U.S. troops persisted without interruption. By January 1972, only 158,000 Americans remained in South Vietnam, the lowest figure since 1965. The North Vietnamese observed these withdrawals carefully and determined it was time to test Vietnamization to its limits. They acknowledged that Nixon's Vietnamization policy had begun to enhance the combat capabilities of the South Vietnamese. However, they believed that the U.S. lacked sufficient combat power in South Vietnam to prevent a defeat of the South Vietnamese if Hanoi initiated a fresh offensive. Consequently, the Politburo in Hanoi ordered a significant invasion of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese assault commenced on March 30, 1972, when 3 divisions surged southward across the demilitarized zone toward Quang Tri and Hue. 3 days later, 3 more divisions advanced from camps in Cambodia into Bin Long province, just 65 miles from Saigon. Additional North Vietnamese forces also attacked across the Cambodian border in the central highlands toward Kon Tum. In total, 14 NVA infantry divisions and 26 separate regiments, comprising around 120,000 troops and approximately 1,200 tanks and other armored vehicles, took part in the offensive, utilizing large-scale conventional infantry tactics supported by tanks, heavy artillery fire, and rockets. This level of warfare was largely unfamiliar to the South Vietnamese. Initially, they were nearly overwhelmed. South Vietnamese forces in Quang Tri retreated in the face of the North's attack, abandoning the city and heading south. In An Loc and Kon Tum, the ARVN soldiers managed to perform better but faced staggering casualties during the North's assaults. The battles continued to rage across South Vietnam into the summer months. U.S. advisors and American air support helped the South Vietnamese hold their ground and ultimately prevail, even reclaiming Quang Tri in September. Nixon proclaimed Vietnamization a significant success. Yet, plenty of evidence suggested otherwise. The South Vietnamese had indeed endured the North Vietnamese assault, but it was a close call that could have tipped in either direction. They had fought commendably in many instances, but not in all. General Abrams remarked that it was American air power and not South Vietnamese arms that had led to the North Vietnamese defeat. However, Nixon and his advisors loudly proclaimed that the victory of South Vietnam was proof of the success of Vietnamization. Jeffrey Kimball notes that Nixon needed Vietnamization to succeed, and because he did, he wanted to believe it could. Therefore, whether it was a positive or negative outcome, Vietnamization received official endorsement, and the South Vietnamese triumph became one of the main justifications for the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces and Nixon's promise of peace with honor. While the conflict persisted in South Vietnam, Henry Kissinger was working diligently to finalize a peace agreement in Paris. By fall 1972, Kissinger and North Vietnamese lead negotiator Le Duc Tho were nearing a deal, but by December, negotiations stalled once more. When the North Vietnamese walked away from the discussions, Nixon initiated the campaign known as the Christmas bombing. Starting on December 18th and lasting 11 days, U.S. B-52s, F-105s, F-4s, F-111s, and A-6s targeted locations throughout North Vietnam, dropping over 40,000 tons of bombs. Shortly after, the North Vietnamese returned to the negotiation table in Paris. Kissinger and Tho finally came to terms, and at 8 a.m. Saigon time on January 28th, a ceasefire was implemented. According to the ceasefire agreement, the United States committed to halting all military actions against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and to withdrawing its remaining troops, including advisors, from South Vietnam within 60 days. U.S. forces departed as promised, with the last troops leaving Saigon on March 29, 1973. That same day, the last 61 American POWs held by the North Vietnamese were freed. Vietnamization had officially ended. America was out of Vietnam. Unfortunately for the South Vietnamese, the Paris Accords did not account for the more than 100,000 North Vietnamese troops that remained within South Vietnam's borders. The ceasefire was brief, and combat resumed as both sides sought to seize as much territory as they could. Throughout 1973 and much of 1974, the North and South Vietnamese battled across South Vietnam. Nixon had pressured Thieu into accepting the Paris Accords, assuring him that the United States would support the South Vietnamese if North Vietnam attempted another major offensive. With this assurance, and utilizing stockpiled weapons and equipment from 1972, the South Vietnamese initially managed to stand their ground against the North Vietnamese. As the stocks began to diminish, Thieu found himself without support. Nixon, grappling with the fallout from the Watergate scandal, was preoccupied with his own political survival and could not muster any concern for the South Vietnamese. On August 9, 1974, Nixon stepped down from the presidency. Thieu and his fellow countrymen had always depended on Nixon's assurances that he would act if the North Vietnamese breached the ceasefire. With Nixon gone, there was a void. His successor, Gerald Ford, asserted that the commitments made by the United States in the past remained intact and would be upheld during his presidency. Yet this promise was unrealistic given the sentiment in Congress. When the North Vietnamese launched a limited offensive against Phuoc Long province, the ARVN's performance was lacking, leading to a swift defeat, with 3,000 soldiers either killed or captured, and they seized significant amounts of military supplies, effectively taking control of the province. The United States remained inactive, leaving both Saigon and Hanoi stunned. Thieu came to the stark realization that his forces were engaged in a poor man's war, while the North Vietnamese, bolstered by ongoing support from China and the Soviet Union, grew stronger each day. The North Vietnamese felt it was the perfect moment for a decisive strike. Believing the United States would either not intervene or be unable to do so, they mapped out a 2-year plan that aimed for large-scale offensives in 1975 to set the stage for a general offensive, general uprising in 1976. They initiated their offensive on March 10, 1975, with an attack on Ban Me Tuot in the Central Highlands, overtaking the city within 2 days and shifting their focus to Pleiku and Kontum. Realizing they were on their own, the South Vietnamese retreated in fear. When Thieu ordered a withdrawal from the highlands to consolidate forces for an attempt to reclaim Ban Me Tuot, this withdrawal quickly escalated into chaos. While communist forces in the highlands advanced toward the coast, more troops from the northern provinces moved down from Quang Tri. One after another, coastal cities and bases were lost. The communists swiftly pushed down the coast, and on April 30, 1975, their tanks breached the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, bringing an end to the war. The South Vietnamese forces, demoralized and overwhelmed, crumbled in under 55 days, marking a failed ultimate test for Vietnamization. In the end, Vietnamization served mostly as a way for the United States to withdraw from South Vietnam, but it fell short of its goal to prepare the South Vietnamese to defend themselves after American troops left. That aim relied on ongoing U.S. support, and when America failed to uphold that promise, South Vietnam's fall became inevitable. There's been debate over whether Nixon and Laird were merely seeking a decent interval or genuinely believed Vietnamization would enable South Vietnam to stand on its own. Both Nixon and Kissinger later claimed they thought the strategy could have succeeded if Congress hadn't cut off aid. However, Jeffrey Kimball argues that Nixon's policies unnecessarily prolonged the war, leading to death, destruction, and division for both Vietnam and America. There are countless what-ifs to ponder, as Louis Sorley points out. Yet it's evident that the South Vietnamese forces' performance in 1975 revealed the tragic flaws in Nixon's exit strategy. When the North Vietnamese launched their offensive in December 1974, the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, which had managed to withstand immense pressure with U.S. support in 1972, found themselves abandoned and faltered in a battle for their nation's survival. The battlefield victory had clearly slipped from the South Vietnamese, but the United States bears significant responsibility for the catastrophe. Despite progress made in preparing the South Vietnamese to take charge of the war, the U.S. hastily signed the Paris Peace Accords, which left over 150,000 North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. When the North Vietnamese attacked and the U.S. failed to honor Nixon's commitment, it sealed the fate of South Vietnam's armed forces. The army that had grown heavily reliant on U.S. firepower and support lost its motivation and was unable to fight independently when that support was taken away. Despite the significant time and resources invested in preparing them to defend themselves, they were sadly unprepared for the challenge once the United States withdrew its backing. It's possible that the outcome might have been different if the United States had insisted on the withdrawal of North Vietnamese forces from South Vietnam in 1973 and continued the promised long-term support, similar to what was offered to the forces in South Korea. However, that did not happen. Ultimately, Vietnamization, along with the flawed peace accords and the failure of the U.S. to honor commitments made by two presidents, resulted in an incomplete exit strategy. While it did remove the United States from Vietnam, it did not ensure the ongoing survival of its ally in Saigon. In the end, Nixon's strategy brought neither peace to the South Vietnamese nor honor to the United States. The final outcome was that the U.S. faced its first loss in war, and the Republic of South Vietnam ceased to exist as an independent nation.